Welcome to Geopolitical Horizon. Today I want to focus on US foreign policy after NATO's exit from Afghanistan. What is the potential and direction of US foreign policy going to be? Let's first look at US-European relations. In a growing number of European capitals, there is a sense that the US made a unilateral decision to withdraw from Afghanistan when in fact it was a collective Article 5 decision to join the military operation in Afghanistan back in 2001, and European countries in NATO then supported the US. So there is now actually, I think, quite irritation and confusion among a lot of European capitals about what really happened with the decision-making leading up to NATO's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. In addition, regarding commerce, the Biden administration maintains its tariffs on Europe on steel and aluminum. So I think there is quite also some irritation regarding, commerce relations between Europe and the US, particularly from a European side. From the US side, the US wants to maintain its pressure and probably is going to maintain its commerce pressure also on Europe going forward. So in terms of US-European relations, they seem to be kind of in disarray and quite some confusion, I think, particularly on the European side in terms of what the US really wants going forward with US-European relations. What about US foreign policy towards the Middle East? While the US is militarily withdrawing from the Middle East, they want to maintain diplomatic pressure, particularly on Iran, but also on Turkey in terms of its purchase of S-400 missiles from Russia. So while we're seeing the US militarily withdrawing from the region, they want to maintain diplomatic pressure, but we're also seeing relations changing between the US and various countries in the Middle East, particularly US-Saudi relations changing after the Biden administration came into office. Very much now we're seeing Saudi Arabia shifting its focus, kind of away from the US, also towards China, but also now seeing if they can find some rapprochement with Iran. Therefore, they've had negotiations in Baghdad since April. We're also going to see, I think, a changing dynamic in the region, which we also saw this weekend with the Baghdad summit, which Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi hosted in Baghdad, where he invited regional leaders, in addition to European leaders such as President Macron of France. So going forward, I think the Middle East is now going to kind of shift away from close relations with the US. This is also because the US has pulled out from the region. The US is very much sending a signal that it wants to maintain less focus on the Middle East, particularly militarily. And in terms of trade relations, probably we're going to see more or less of the same because the US doesn't have the strategic trade and infrastructure and industrial capacity that China does have. So the US cannot really engage in terms of building infrastructure corridors around the Middle East. So in terms of US-Middle East relations going forward, we're probably going to see less focus on the Middle East, in terms of security and military affairs, but probably we're going to see the Biden administration trying to focus on putting diplomatic pressure, particularly on Iran, but also, trying to stay engaged diplomatically in the region. What about US foreign policy towards China? Very much we're seeing, the Biden administration focusing on competition with China. Very much though, we're seeing actually the US foreign policy being very reactive in terms of, a relationship with China. They're kind of reacting to what China does. China has a very active global One Belt strategy focus, and that is very much what China is continuing focusing on. They're focusing on strengthening trade, economic activity. China is building economic corridors across the world, across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and towards Europe. And therefore, and Southeast Asia, China is going to continue doing that. However, what we're seeing from the US side, and I think what we should expect from the US going forward, is that US foreign policy is just going to react to what China does. The US is going to try to strengthen partnerships with countries to counter China. Therefore, it's very much a reactive policy towards China, and that is just not going to give the results that the US wants. The US is not going to be able to strengthen its global position in that way. It's actually going to kind of just flow in disarray. And that is where I really see US foreign policy going forward. US foreign policy towards Europe, US foreign policy also towards other countries is quite in disarray because the US lacks the strategic trade, industrial, and infrastructure tools to develop a global infrastructure policy, which China does have with its One Belt, One Road strategy. So while the US very much focuses on security and diplomatic engagement, China focuses on infrastructure development, trade, and economic corridors, which it is building around the world. And that gives China very much an edge in terms of its relationship with other countries. While there are some critical issues that China is also aware of, the US is constantly bombarding China with criticism and attacks on a range of issues. But this is really, I think, going to be counterproductive for the US in the long term, because it doesn't leave the US with a position to, really have an active policy towards China. So in terms of US-China relations, we're going to see more of the same. We're going to see US continue to attack in China in terms of its policies, in terms of what China is doing. But China is just going to continue with its active global One Belt, One Road strategy. So in terms of US relations with China, more of the same, but probably not going to give the results that the US and the Biden administration really would have wanted. Now, what about the US policy in Asia after pulling out of Afghanistan? Well, after pulling out of Afghanistan, this really provides and leaves a void, and really Afghanistan drifting towards China and Russia in the future. I think also both President Putin and President Xi now will do what they can to strengthen relations with the Taliban going forward. They maintain their embassies in Kabul, and they really want to focus on getting Afghanistan around the negotiating table so that Afghanistan can be a part of infrastructure architecture in the region in the future. This also relates to the China-Iran strategic agreement, but also in terms of, the Russian position on building infrastructure across Central Asia, across Afghanistan into Pakistan, which will also connect into the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So I think very much now the US is left out of the negotiating table. The US is no longer present in the region. And while the US wants to stay diplomatically engaged, as Secretary of State Blinken said, and President Biden has also reiterated, but that just kind of leaves them able to provide kind of diplomatic pressure, but it doesn't really give the US a position or ability or a chance to build relations in terms of trade, economic corridors, and infrastructure, connectivity, because that is what the region really needs, and that's what the region wants, and that is what China and Russia will provide going forward, and which they are by building infrastructure corridors and strengthening trade relations on the ground. So the US now, after NATO pulling out of Afghanistan, is very much out of the Eurasian landscape. US-India relations are very good. However, India, because of its conflictual bilateral relations with its neighbors, India does not really have the capacity or ability to build now infrastructure corridors with its neighboring countries. Therefore, the US is kind of left in a state of disarray in terms of where US-India relations can also take US foreign policy in the Eurasian landscape going forward. So very much so, we're seeing the US more and more left out of the Eurasian negotiating table, and that is also leaving US foreign policy in a state of confusion about where it can go forward. Now, so therefore, we're seeing, I think US foreign policy in the future quite in disarray, confusion in terms of what can really US foreign policy achieve. Yes, they're going to continue with diplomatic pressure. We're going to see US sanctions continue towards a range of countries, but that's pushing these countries also towards China, and that is going to change the global power dynamics, which is not what the US really wants, because the US wants to maintain its preeminence. But we're seeing US foreign policy being counterproductive because the continued sanctions towards Iran and other countries, really takes these countries away from the US towards China, and therefore, strengthens China's ability to build relations on trade, infrastructure corridors, and economic activity and relations. So we're actually seeing now US foreign policy in disarray. There is quite some confusion around the world, I think, about what the US really wants and where is the US headed with its foreign policy. I think a lot of capitals and countries around the world would much rather see a very much more engaged and actively focused US foreign policy, strengthening trade relations and strengthening internal manufacturing and industrial capacity. Remains to be seen if the US will be able to do that with its large infrastructure bill, which is now going to be implemented. So in terms of the future, where we are going to see US relations with the world and US foreign policy remains to be seen, but I think we're going to see quite some confusion going forward and US foreign policy in disarray because it lacks the tools that are relevant today in terms of having the trade capacity, the infrastructure capacity, and the industrial capacity to strengthen economic relations with countries around the world, which the US should have focused on. Well, thank you so much for joining, and please remember to subscribe to Geopolitical Horizon. I look forward to see you again. Thank you.